Hello and welcome to your dose of daily outrage from Union Solidarity International. My name is Walton Pantland and with me is Andrew Brady. And it really looks like it's kicking off everywhere at the moment. There have been massive protests in Brazil. These protests have been going on for a week, but they got really serious last night when between 100 and 200,000 people took to the streets in 7 different Brazilian cities. It's a really, really interesting protest movement and one that we're going to look at very, very closely because it bears strong similarities to some of the things which are happening in Turkey and also in other countries, but there are significant differences as well. The first similarity is that the trigger for the protest was something which was initially a relatively small, comparatively minor issue, and that is the raising of bus fare, public transport tickets, by about 10 or 20 cents or pence, depending on the currency you're working with. But the real trigger was the police response. And there's a similarity there with Turkey, where it was a relatively small localized protest against the development of an urban park, and there was terrible police repression, and that caused a huge amount of outrage. And this seems to be what's happened in Brazil, is that the police response, police repression of the protest against the raising of the bus fare has caused the biggest protest that Brazil has seen since the end of the military dictatorship in 1985. The other thing that strikes us as quite interesting is the fact that the urban geography plays a role, and particularly urban geography in cities which are booming and where there's a lot of money flowing through, like Turkey. Brazil's economy is doing quite well, and the urban geography element of the Turkish protest was the fact that it's about people's right to the city and right to green space in the city, as opposed to the right of corporations to build shopping malls. In the case of Brazil, the geography element is the fact that so many workers live a long way from home, and transport is a major, major expense. So what seems like a nominal increase in the cost of transport is actually make or break for people. And that's very, very interesting. The other thing that is interesting and quite different, though, is the response of the Brazilian government and the context that is happening in, because we have a very socially conservative government in Turkey and essentially progressive and secular forces who are protesting against that government. Brazil, by contrast, has a at least comparatively left-wing government. The ruling party is the Partido dos Trabalhadores, the Workers' Party. That party has a program called Balsa Familia, which has done a lot to reduce inequality and improve access to education for people from poorer and ethnic minority backgrounds. It's certainly a policy which developing countries around the world look at. I know that the unions in South Africa, for example, would like the South African government to adopt a lot of the Brazilian government strategies. And so it's interesting to see the outrage that develops in Brazil, quite a different state. And I guess the thing that strikes me as common there is the police repression, the authoritarianism. And there's some suggestion that there is an authoritarian political culture in the Brazilian security services that goes back to the days of the dictatorship that was never actually fully dealt with and never fully got rid of. And it's that connection between that state authoritarianism and corporate and neoliberal interests, because obviously the big thing that's happening in Brazil at the moment is preparations for the next World Cup. And although the state is spending a lot of money, that money is being spent on World Cup projects. It's a lot of state money being spent on private companies, and certainly in the minds of citizens, there's collusion between politicians who may be corrupt and companies who are essentially milking this opportunity to make a lot of money. And it's interesting because this is a booming economy, but there is obviously a real tension between the people who are making the money and the ordinary citizens who don't feel that they can actually cope in the situation. What's your reading of it, Andrew?
I think the person who you just referred to, the president, is very important here. President Roussef, of course, she was a political prisoner of the junta herself and spent several years in prison, tortured at the hands of the dictatorship. So her response is going to be absolutely critical. And so far, she has delivered a moderating influence on some of the authoritarian tendencies that are still prevalent within Brazilian society, recognising that there is a right to protest. And after the police used rubber bullets and tear gas last week in Sao Paulo, she has given an order that no rubber bullets should be fired. So there is a very important difference from what we're seeing in Turkey, which goes to her own personal history, Walton. I don't think we can discount that. It's a very important point. Of course, the situation in Brazil is a very complex one, and while under the previous president, Lula, more than 30 million, Walton, 30 million people were lifted out of poverty as a result of the policies that were put in place. A quite remarkable achievement that other left of centre and left-wing governments within Southern America have tried to follow that path. However, there has been a slowdown in economic growth. There is high inflation relatively, at 6.5%, and high levels of violent crime. These are very important issues that, despite the economic progress that has been made, there is deep-rooted poverty and areas where there is high crime, which are impacting on society, despite the progress that has been made. And of course, it touches on a very important issue, because the Confederations Cup, which is getting played in Brazil at the moment, with the World Cup coming, with the Summer Olympics coming, these are major high-profile events, and it's giving the Brazilian people an opportunity to say, despite the progress that is being made, we want investment in our public services. How much are we going to benefit as a result of all these events? Of course, we had the London Olympics not that long ago, and we spoke about the Olympics legacy. And we look back in other Olympic Games and other high-profile sporting events, including South Africa, Walton, with yourself, where you come from. You know, what was the real lasting legacy for people on the ground? So while I'm sure a lot of Brazilians are very happy with a lot of these events that are coming to their country and showcasing the massive progress that has been made in Brazil, it's no longer an emerging economy. It's one of the big, higher than the UK. What levels of investment and how much will the people benefit? And that's what they're really saying here. And, you know, it's important that the government, when it's going forward, addresses these very important issues. And if we look to other sporting events, there's been a very mixed legacy in how people benefit at the local level. And while you're right, Walton, it was the bus tickets that has been the spark. It is these wider issues that are at play in Brazil at the moment. And it's going to be fascinating how the Brazilian government responds. Thus far, it seems to have had a very moderating and responsible approach to the protests, in contrast with what is going on in Turkey, and that's very important. And I would really encourage you to check out the background of President Roussef, which is a very interesting one, and perhaps this different approach is illustrative of her own personal background.
Absolutely. In fact, I think the correlation that you made between Brazil and South Africa is actually quite a good one, because South Africa is another country which has seen quite impressive economic growth, but we saw with the Marikana massacre and a lot of the unrest there last year that growth is certainly uneven, and that a lot of ordinary people don't feel like they're beneficiaries. And so what is superficially a good news story, what looks to the rest of the world like a democracy with a growing economy, that's not always the full picture. And I think that is what we're seeing in Brazil is that kind of complicated impact of tremendous social pressures and economic pressures on a dynamic and complex country. And one of the things about these protests, which seems to be interesting, is their cross-class nature. There are people on the protest from the favelas, but also unemployed graduates from the cities, and that is quite interesting in Brazil, and would be interesting in South Africa as well. That it seems to be quite a wide social base.
Just to pick up on another point as well, that it wasn't that long ago and earlier on this year, and that President Roussef herself was the beneficiary of 79% approval ratings in the poll. I mean, it's truly outstanding figures of popularity, and they have been affected somewhat as a result of the protests over the last week. But I think her response and her government's response, has been a very responsible one, Walton, in contrast to Turkey. And I think we can't over-emphasise this point. And of course, there is elections next year, which, like in South Africa, it looks as if the Workers' Party will romp to a victory in a very similar way that the ANC often do in South Africa. And I think the people are using these sporting events as an occasion to say, while there's been great progress that has been made, the distribution of that economic growth hasn't gone as far as it should have done.
Absolutely. Just in reference to what we said at the beginning about it kicking off everywhere, it clearly is. I mean, we've seen Greece for a long time. We've seen Turkey recently. Two you may have missed are Sarajevo in Bosnia and Sofia, Bulgaria. There were massive protests and an occupation of a Parliament Square in Sarajevo due to the fact that a baby girl couldn't get medical treatment. So once again, a relatively small trigger event that caused essentially disgusted politicians and public outrage. In Sofia, there were massive protests when a media mogul was made head of national security. So if you're looking at that from a UK context, it's the equivalent of making Rupert Murdoch, putting him in charge of MI5 or something like that.
Is he not?
So times where we're seeing patterns of insurrection, revolt, and demonstrations from citizens around the world who don't feel that they're being adequately represented by their governments. And it comes back to what you said a few days ago about how this is reminiscent of the revolutionary way of 1848, or some of the uprisings then, which had a lasting, very important effect, but quite an uneven effect on world politics. And yeah, it leaves us in interesting times, doesn't it?
But the huge difference is information technology, that while in 1848 we had isolated pockets all across Europe of spontaneous revolutionary protests, the difference, of course, today is the ability to communicate. There's a real momentum going on. I think the word that is being used is snowballing. And one of the main factors behind the protests in Brazil is, unsurprisingly, social media. And this is the thing that knits a lot of these protests together, that it is taking place as a result of there being a snowball effect in social media, which is encouraging people onto the streets. And the power of social media is becoming so important. And there's a real lesson, of course, Walton, for us who come from the labour movement background, about how we can harness this potential of social media to mobilise people in a way that we haven't done before. And there's real potential in being able to coordinate across countries when we are targeting specific companies, whether it is Nestle, whether it is the Hyatt's Hertz campaign. There is opportunities for labour union members and progressives to connect in a way that we have never been able to do before across borders. And it's a very important part of what USI is designed to do. But like in Brazil, like in Turkey, like in Greece, like in Egypt, the real momentum behind a lot of these campaigns and protests is social media. And I think that's something we have got to look at, and how we can learn the lessons about how we can apply this to an industrial context as well, Walton.
Absolutely, I think you're quite right, Andrew. Now, we've reported over the past few days about the Greek state broadcaster ERT being taken off the air, and the massive protests, not just in Greece but around the world, in solidarity with journalists from the ERT. Now, a court has ordered that the station be reopened. Can you tell us what's happening there, Andrew?
Yes. There has been an appeal court which has ordered ERT to be brought back online after 6 days of the public broadcaster being taken off the air just in a matter of hours when the government announced it. However, like all courts, there is an issue about them also vindicating the Prime Minister Samaras's position. There's always a snag, Walton.
They need to make it lean, and
need to make it lean. So in essence, we are sanctioning ERT being brought back online, but we're also sanctioning you as the government to be able to cut and gut and to make this absolutely lean, decimating the labour force and their terms and conditions, of course. And this action was taken, we must bear in mind, in order for the government of Greece to secure its next tranche in the bailout programme. So the European authorities have known exactly what the Greek government was going to do. And then you've got to see this. It was astounding where the European Commission were issuing press releases saying we did not sanction this move, but it's up to the government of Greece to decide what they want to do. Doing a Pontius Pilate. Sorry, European Commission and other European authorities and the Troika et al. It just doesn't wash. It's absolute bull. That the Greek government were going to take ERT offline, but what they weren't prepared for was an absolute backlash, not only against the Greek government, but against the European authorities who have been complicit in this. And I'm afraid Pontius Pilate doesn't work.
And you're quite right.
We've got another couple of issues that we would like to raise with our listeners and viewers, Walton, if you don't mind. One, if you look at our website right now, was an interview we had today with Charlie Donnelly of the National Union of Workers in Australia. A really fascinating conversation, Walton, where he spoke about the casualisation of the labour force in Australia and how his union is working with other unions across the world and global unions in the IUF to put pressure and to use leverage on companies such as Nestle, which we've referred to, and of course talking about the very topical events in Australia at the moment with the impending federal elections later on this year. So a really fascinating conversation with Charlie, which we would really encourage you to listen to when you get the opportunity. And there is, of course, a number of featured articles in relation to Occupy Gezi Park, which there are absolute must-reads from our perspective to allow our viewers and listeners and supporters to get a different perspective about what is going on in Turkey at the moment as events continue to unfold. And the last thing I would refer everybody to is a conversation we're going to be having with Walter Sanchez of the CNM CUT in Brazil on Friday, where we'll be talking about a number of the pertinent issues that are affecting the labour movement in Brazil, and of course we will be touching on the issues which we spoke about earlier on in our daily edition of Outrage. A number of really important articles and conversations that are already featured on our streams, and more to come this week.
Once again, thank you for listening to or watching your dose of daily outrage from Union Solidarity International.